Hey guys, welcome to the Lunge and Lift podcast. Today we are going to talk about how your feet are failing you. So you can expect to learn the common ways in which foot function is holding back your performance and potentially causing you pain, and a few tips on what you can do to improve your feet. But before we get into it, as always, a big thank you to our show sponsors, thetrainingstimulus.com. Please check out the website if you would like to learn more about movement mechanics. Wit-fitness.com. Please use discount code LL15 to get 15% off your purchase. And Hydro, use discount code LL20 to get 20% off your blood flow restriction apparel. Rob, feet.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, for me, I didn't realize how bad. So for start off, I apologize for my voice. I've currently got a bit of a cold, so hence the block sounding nose. But when it comes to the feet, like I remember having my first assessment with you, like way back, and like identifying a lot of things from me, and then how you kind of actually like kind of told me in a way where I had quite flat feet, but like quite you saw quite common that so you saw it was quite common that quite strong people had quite flat feet. Not saying that that's the reason they're making you strong, but that you saw that as you saw it in quite a few other athletes. I'm classing myself as an athlete here, but you saw it across the board that there was quite some strong people with flat feet. And I didn't really ever realize this because I was just like, I just felt my feet and I didn't actually think too much about it. But when you actually, and then when I done your mentorship and started to really break down the fundamentals of like foot mechanics, as I'm just like, fuck, like it really impacts so much. And like when you talk about how much does it impact, how much it impacts up the body, you're like, yeah. So I thought today's episode was awesome to kind of dive into, maybe just keep it quite like have like fundamentals, and then like we can do a bit more of a deeper dive later down the line of if anyone wants to know a little bit more. So shall we set the scene?
Yeah, exactly. So to set the scene, even though you've done a very good job of it there, I think I wanted to do this episode because it's something that's come up a few times recently in assessments and having chats with the clients and athletes that I was working with. I think it became quite clear that feet are underappreciated in terms of how important they are, and they give us huge clues as to what might be holding back your performance. And like Rob said there's some very interesting patterns you see. And the flat feet and strong people, I've seen a lot of people who particularly have heavy deadlifts tend towards flat feet, where let's say they've got lower arches or their arch is pretty low to the floor. That just seems to be a common trend. And in this episode, I want to dig into a few of the other common presentations that we see in the feet. And hopefully that gives you something to look out for in your own training, but also if you've got your own clients to look out for, and get some easy wins to improve not just foot mechanics, because like Rob said there, it affects everything above the feet, which is the whole rest of the body. So if we can get the feet working better, then everything works better.
Yeah. So for me, I think when I started to learn more about the feet, understanding how much that, say, knee pain tends to stem from either the hips or the feet. Because normally, like when pain does appear somewhere, it normally is due to that's the end point of where the discomfort is going in the first place to break. So for me, the way I picture it is normally wherever there's a first bend, that's going to be where the discomfort will probably come. So if it's coming from the feet, the pain's going to go up the body until the first point, which is then normally the knee. Same as like say from the shoulder, it's going to go out and probably go towards the elbow. So because it's rather than say the wrist. I don't know if that's what do you think to that is.
There's a lot of logic in that. So basically, when we look at a movement, we always want to understand where that movement starts in the body. So in running, for example, if you're getting knee pain when you run, it's most likely or most often on the foot that's hitting the floor rather than the foot that's swinging in space or behind you. And so the ground reaction force that is initiated from contact with the ground, obviously that starts at the floor and then runs its way up the body. And depending where the dysfunction is, will dictate where in the body that stress has to be dealt with. So if the stress isn't dealt with well in the foot, that shock wave is going to come up to the knee, and that might be how the pain manifests. And like you said there, depending on what movement triggers the pain, we can get clues as to why it's manifesting in that part of the body, because at the end of the day, the body is a system, everything's connected. So if stress, force, load is coming from a certain part of the body, it has to go through. You can't jump from a wrist to a shoulder, it has to pass through the elbow. There's no scientific known way, unless it like telepathy just jumps across the elbow. So when we're assessing things like feet, because they are the first point of contact with the world for so many movements, whether it's running or any static lifting, they're a hugely important part, because the dysfunction at the feet has to get absorbed somewhere else in the body. It could be at the knee, could be at the hip, could be at the back, could even be at the shoulder. I've seen some crazy cases where just altering the position of somebody's heel will improve the way their spine rotates, which alleviates somebody's shoulder pain. So that was the root excuse me. The root cause was an ankle injury they had years and years ago, which ultimately led to shoulder pain. So I don't think we can overstate the importance of assessing and addressing foot mechanics, because it can be hugely influential in the way that somebody's body functions.
Yeah, and I think, like, what are some common things that you've kind of seen come up in assessments that obviously we mentioned there about, like, say, the flat feet and strong deadlifters? Like, what else do you see?
Yeah, so the ones that have come up recently are heels lifting, either in squats or deadlifts. And there's a few reasons why this can happen. The two main ones I would say are just your natural balance point. So if somebody has played a sport or spent a lot of time on their toes, they feel more comfortable or stronger driving through the forefoot rather than the heel. I would put myself in this category as well. Just if you play field sports or racket sports where you're changing directions, you want to be on your toes more, because it's faster to get off the ground and change direction. And if that has been your tendency historically, when you pick up a heavy weight, your body is going to want to put more force through the forefoot. And over time, this can eventually lead to heels coming off the ground. So I saw one client recently in his, we were talking about this before we recorded, in his deadlift setup, his natural balance point was so far forwards that his heels were off the ground. And I've not really seen it many times, but in his body, that feels like where he should be to put maximum force into the ground. And this obviously has a lot of implications, but fundamentally, he's gone from having 4 points of contact, the forefoot and the heel, in both feet, or 6 if we consider big toe and pinky toe as separate points of contact, to 2. So he's much less stable. So that means everything upstream of his feet is having to provide extra stability. So you might feel that certain muscles are tight or overworking just to stay balanced. Whereas if he had the whole foot on the floor, he would feel much more stable and actually able to generate more force. So for him, it was a case of teaching him what a better balance point would be, and that actually, if he keeps his heels down, he'll be more stable, and then you can actually recruit more muscle. The other reason that heels tend to leave the ground is a lack of dorsiflexion. So if you're not able to close the angle between the shin and the foot, and this can be for a variety of reasons, could be tight calves, which is the most common thought process people have. But because we're focusing on feet today, we're going to talk about the inability to pronate the foot. So this is the flattening of the arch, the spreading of the foot. So the foot will lengthen and widen as the arch drops towards the ground. And this allows, think of it as the bones unlocking and allowing that shin bone to move forwards in space. And if the foot doesn't unlock, the shin bone can't go as far forwards. So you can get a block in dorsiflexion from foot mechanics and or calf mobility.
Yeah, this reminds me of when I was trying to learn to pistol squat, and then in having some old school thought patterns of my knee needs to be out, those sort of things. So this is obviously a good while ago, but having those kind of thoughts, and I just could never get into a position because I could never be balanced for a start. And then also the reality of the sliding bone in the ankle, like basically, or at the top of the foot, yeah, the ankle. Then as soon as my knee went tracked over towards the big toe, it unlocked that foot because my foot could pronate, it flattened out, and then my knee was able to go over the toe and give myself that range of motion that I needed. And then I'd had other issues which had to be addressed, which then got me that pistol squat. But it was the understanding of how important it was of that flattening of the foot first of all, beyond just general tightness. Because even though I have decent mobility, I do have certain restrictions, and stability was a massive one for me that I lacked. And a lot of that, as I mentioned there, was because I didn't understand that thing of how I needed to let my foot essentially relax into position rather than always trying to claw the floor and create this superficial tension. And then it meant that my knee and it all couldn't work synergistically. It had to work just segmented, and it doesn't. When you're trying to do gymnastics, it can't be segmented.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. In that whatever your body is doing, it's doing it for a good reason because it's trying to help you. So when somebody's foot is flat or tends towards a low arch, what is that doing to help the athlete? And it's basically pre-positioning you to help with that pronation. So you're kind of in a pseudo pronated start position. And one of the reasons why it's so important is that starts the chain reaction up the leg for internal rotation. So we get pronation of the foot, knee valgus, so the knee turns in slightly, which allows the hip to internally rotate, which recruits the glutes in the transverse plane. So this is a perfect illustration of how foot mechanics can be so important, is that if that foot can't flatten, then you can't recruit your glutes. It's as simple as that. So when you see these really strong people like you, able to lift a lot of weight, and they tend towards a flatter foot, my interpretation of that is predisposing them to use that internal rotation mechanic to get the biggest, strongest muscles of the body firing in, for example, a deadlift. And if we apply the same logic to why do people lean onto their toes and let their heels lift, what's that doing? That's allowing them to bias the muscle groups that they feel strongest in. So maybe they've got strong calves, so they want to get some tension through the ankles. Usually they have very strong quads, or they're quad biased, and potentially lower back biased as well. So if you're a deadlifter and we'll say, so in deadlifting, if the day or two afterwards you're sore in your quads and your lower back and never in your hamstrings or your glutes, you're probably forefoot dominant. And it's not necessarily wrong. Like, everyone has a part of their body that they prefer to load and prefer to avoid, but you're potentially missing out on some posterior chain recruitment, which you would get better if you could keep that heel contact and sit back more into the deadlift.
Yeah, I found as well is it's the willingness to experiment as well, like positions, because like for instance, I've kind of found my sweet spot at this moment in time, like with my body weight, my general tension in my body. Like if I have my feet quite narrow but slightly turned out, I find I get much better tension through my hamstrings, my glutes and everything. And in my head, the reason why this is happening, and I'd love to hear from you, but where I do have pronation already in the feet, by turning my feet out, I'm kind of making them, supinating them a bit. So then the pronation actually works better. So this is in my head. So it's works. I'm actually getting the feeling of pronation, which is then able to get into my hamstrings and glutes rather than having my feet straight, already pronated in a soft position. The tension isn't as much. So in my head, I think I'm putting myself into, like when we use wedges and stuff like that for squats, and you're putting yourself into a position to allow access to that. So I'm thinking that's my thought process.
Yeah. So I think this is a really nice point. We talk about the distinction between position and motion. So the thing that loads muscles is the movement, it is the motion. So it's the change in joint angle rather than the position the joint is in. So if you turn your feet out, that's an externally rotated position. So external rotation is shortening the glutes, which means they're not loading. But because you're pre-positioning in external rotation, that means you actually have more space from which to internally rotate. So your body is now internally rotating through motion, which loads the glutes. So you're putting yourself in theoretically a less biomechanically advantageous position to start with, to give yourself the feeling, and that was the key word you used, and the experience of internally rotating, which is the part that loads the muscles. So this is why a lot of people who are tight or maybe lack internal rotation feel better toeing out. It's part of the reason why people like toeing out in squats, because from that toe out position, you're able to move towards internal rotation better. And the moving towards it is where the loading is happening.
Yeah, that makes sense. And yeah, not supination, external rotation. I don't know what I was thinking, but anyway, no, I know. But the thing thinking about my squat and how I notice as well when I step back, I'm not actually as toed out as I would be with my deadlift. And I think that's just because of the stance, because I'm so much narrower, I haven't got that much room, so I need to find that room from somewhere. But that only come about because I experimented with kind of what I knew, say, some of my dysfunctional limitations are and where my strengths lie. So how can I position myself best within my constraints to get the most out of it? Because obviously with the deadlift, you have to essentially, you can stand anywhere because you've got sumo deadlift or whatever. So I found what is my best stance for that. And when I low bar squatted and I had quite a wide stance, I'd get too much discomfort in my hips, because I'd feel I'd be more jamming myself into a position rather than kind of, as you say, that with that motion, like kind of like screwing myself into the bottom of the squat to get myself out. So now, since I come a little bit narrow with not so wide feet, I found my best stance. But I have quite a few clients that all have to be quite wide and stuff because that's where they feel best. And it's like, This is where, when it comes to coaching as well, I find you, especially with group coaching, you kind of make sure you understand that there's some fundamental movement patterns that we kind of want to shift towards and make this is roughly what we want it to look like. But if your deadlift's not looking like my deadlift, I'm not going to say yours is right or wrong, just like you alluded to earlier. It's not right or wrong, but maybe you could be more efficient in certain things. And that, so you might have a different deadlift because of your restrictions, but by then, as you said earlier, with the toes up, heels up, that person was lacking efficiency of being able to recruit their posterior chain and be able to essentially get another point of contact to lift more weight.
Yeah, exactly. And like we said before, the common issue that goes with the toe bias deadlift is lower back pain. So this is what that client was experiencing. He'd get to a certain point with progressing his deadlift, and then the lower back would flare up again. And the telltale clue was no hamstrings and no glutes especially no glutes in his soreness. Like he would never feel his glutes doing any work. And in a deadlift, you definitely want to be getting as much as you can out of the glutes. As we always said, biggest, strongest muscle in the body. So we want them to be picking up as much work as we can. All right. So I think the next one, we're going to move on to the big toe coming off the floor. So this is a common one, especially in the CrossFit world. If you haven't heard the multiple times we talked about knee valgus and the knees out cue, check back. I think episode 3 is the big one on knee valgus, but we talk about it a lot of times throughout the podcast.
3 or 4 early doors.
Yeah.
One of the reasons we actually started this podcast, actually, because it was when I come to you about it, it was like, I kind of want to get this message out. And that's why it was quite an important episode, which has been referred back to so many times. And like, it's funny, from coaching now some like general public people again, it actually reminded me that some people are still even thinking that knees can't go over the toes. So not only is there the knee valgus thing, there's still the knee over the toe thing. You're just like, fuck, like you forget when you're so in it, especially as a coach, like you're so in this world. We often talk about, but how you forget how some of the things that you know is just like common that everyone should know. You realize that actually, fuck, it's people still think this, because again,
Yeah.
things like say Men's Health, like Daily Mail and stuff like that, people are seeing pictures of say squats, and just like this relates to kind of like weightlifting, that lean back motion, because it's the cool looking part of the weightlifting movement. Then that's what people think they need to do, because and I done this was me, I remember thinking that was how I got the best pull, and remember getting told off continuously saying no, pull up, not back, and it massively
Yeah.
helped once I actually understood the movement.
Yeah, exactly. I think it is getting better. I think you do see more and more people talking about knee valgus not being the devil or evil or bad for you, and actually much better for performance, and actually reduces injury if it's applied correctly. And so to link it back to the big toe coming off the floor, a lot of people, having been taught to squat driving their knees out, experience this issue, and it's most commonly connected to knee pain. So what's happening when we drive our knees out in a squat is that we're essentially sending mixed messages to the body. So trying to drive the knee out, we're going into external rotation, which does link with supination. So what you're saying earlier is correct, in that we're creating a higher arch, which stiffens the foot. So we want some arch to provide a nice stable foundation from which to push. But as we descend into a squat, that's the loading phase. So that means all the major muscle groups should be lengthening and storing elastic potential energy. So as you drop into the squat, your glutes should be getting longer, your quad should be getting longer, your calves should be getting longer, and even the plantar fascia and the tissues on the underside of the foot should be getting longer, because they have to lengthen before they can shorten. That's how muscles fundamentally work. So if we're driving our knees out, we're going into that external rotation, which stiffens the foot and is asking the arch to rise, which is conflicting everything else that's going on in the body, because we're asking everything else to lengthen and load up. So this mechanic can then overspill into other areas of life, like running, where when the foot hits the floor, it should be a similar mechanic, in that the foot unlocks, the foot spreads, flattens, pronates, absorbs impact, and then it stiffens to propel us off. But if we've trained our foot to always externally rotate and supinate and stiffen, that means we get this jarring impact when we hit the ground, because that foot is now no longer very good at shock absorption upon ground contact. This also affects the squat. So obviously we've talked about it in the squat affecting running. It also affects the squat, in that if you're trying to squat by driving your knees out without your big toe on the floor, one, you're missing a point of contact. So again, we're going from those 6 points of contact across the 2 feet to 4, because the big toes are now off the ground. But because we're blocking that internal rotation mechanic, pronation, letting the knees drop in, we're also missing that muscle recruitment that we were talking about earlier. So where Rob's got slightly flatter feet and he goes from toe out to allow the internal rotation to recruit the glutes. If that big toe stays off the floor, we don't get the opportunity to internally rotate that leg and therefore recruit the glutes, especially in that transverse plane. So you're not only potentially hurting your knees, but you're also costing yourself strength and performance. And yeah, I think one of my favorite ways to explain to people how important and how effective using knee valgus is that whenever anybody does a proper, authentic 1 rep max, their knees have to twitch in, because the body knows where the strength is. So the knee twitch in is how you maximally recruit those biggest, strongest muscles, the glutes, and stand up your heaviest squat. So the subconscious knows this, even if we try to override it consciously. So keeping those big toes on the floor is super important.
Yeah, that honestly, it's funny because all these things we spoke about this pre-podcast on a different discussion, and how the subconscious movements that I do before I lift, and like how the deadlift, using this example, even though I turn my feet out, I have like a little feeling, and I like I'm kind of like rocking in the feet, feeling my full foot pressure once I then feel the big foot on the ground and I create that tension, is then when I tuck my hips under, pull my ribcage down, big deep belly breath with my shoulders protracted, and I go down into that, and I can feel my full foot driven down into that ground, especially with the slack pull where I pull the weight out of the bar. Basically, I'm pushing myself into the ground, so then I have that feeling of essentially just standing up rather than trying to pick up, which is a visualization thing. Is going to be easier to do to just stand up rather than pick something up with your back. And same as a squat, so as I'm stepping back, I don't perform the squat until, well, first of all, when I unrack the bar, I make sure my feet are under the bar, both feet, so I have that full foot pressure, so I stand up fully loaded. Then I step back, wait till the bar's not moving, again, find my big toe, because whenever I don't find my big toe and I squat down, the rep always hip shoot up first. I fold forward a little bit more because I've lost that point of contact. And like, even the bench press, like for me to create maximal tension in the bench press, again, I'm making sure my big toe is pressed into the ground. A lot of that is to get my adductor firing up, to get my glutes fully contracted, all that feeling of tension in my lower body, so that I'm pressing through one solid structure rather than just my upper body. And when you're trying to perform the maximum weight possible on a bench press, you want to have that full body working together. And just again, thinking on the 3 points of contact, something that a way I used to always explain to people was, what would be the easiest thing to push over from a column to a wall to a pyramid? It's like to push over a pyramid is going to be the hardest thing. So that's what we want. We want to have a pyramid on the floor. So that's going to create the most amount of surface area possible so that things aren't going to go wrong.
Exactly. Yeah, I was about to say that. You beat me to it. The principle. That's good. I like that explanation. The principle is, the more points of contact you have, the more stability you can create, and we're all applying this subconsciously without even knowing it. Like, if you're trying to pick up something really heavy from the floor, you won't do it on one foot. You'll definitely have both feet on the floor, and you'll probably put the other hand down as well, getting yourself into almost like a bent over row, like a single arm bench bent over row type position, because your body naturally tries to create more stability to allow it to produce as much force as we can. So we want to leverage that to our advantage when we're training, in that if the movement permits, give ourselves the most number of points of contact. So having all 6 points of contact in both feet on the ground is going to do that for any standing movement. But you see this applied really well through bodybuilding, where I'm trying to think of a good example, like even on a machine like a leg press, they'll put handles on so you can grip and create extra points of contact. You don't, if you leg pressed with your hands across your chest or hands in the air, it would be harder than doing a leg press gripping the handles, right?
Yeah, I always remember how much I used to pull myself into the thing to create that pressure.
Yeah, exactly. And that's just another way of giving yourself extra points of contact to create more stability, which allows greater force generation. And it's only through, let's call them bad habits, that we lose the tendency to keep all 3 points of contact on the ground. So yeah, I think those are sort of the main common presentations we see through the feet. And hopefully now you're seeing that they're very important, because they can lead to injury if you've got dysfunctional feet, but also you're leaving a lot of performance on the table if you're not getting the most out of your foot contact. So in terms of those issues, let's walk through some easy fixes. Like, obviously it can be a little bit more nuanced. Feet, I think it's 26 bones in the foot and 33 joints. So there's a lot going on in each foot that potentially needs to be addressed. But in terms of these basic presentations, we want to give you some simple takeaways to work on them. The first one, it's the most obvious one, is obviously just through cueing. So you can literally say, make sure that big toe stays on the ground, or try and keep your heel in contact with the ground. And that might be enough. If somebody's not got anything really going on, it's just a subconscious pattern that they're not even aware of, then that's potentially a very easy fix. The other thing you can do for heels coming off the ground, or you can do this for actually the big toes coming off the ground, anytime there is a gap. One of my teachers, Gary Ward, who's amazing at all foot mechanics stuff, he is known for his use of wedges. So if you bring the ground to the foot, so if the heel is floating a centimeter off the ground, you can put a little wedge or a plate under the heel. So it's in that same balance position, you retain contact with the ground. And I think this gets looked down on a lot. It's like, oh, you can't squat. You've got to put heel wedges in. You're not doing a proper squat. It serves a purpose. So, you know, in life, you probably don't want to walk around in weightlifting shoes. But if your training stimulus is to train your squat pattern, then having heel contact is going to help your squat pattern. You might need to work on your mobility or your foot mechanics to be able to get heel contact without a heel wedge. But is the training stimulus to get a heel to the floor squat, or is the training stimulus to get a stronger squat and load it up in a safe and better pattern? Make that decision, and you can decide whether heel wedges are the right call for you. And we can apply the same logic to the big toes coming off. So you can put a little wedge under the big toes to bring the floor up so you can maintain that contact. And the magic here is really around the nervous system, in that once the brain realizes the big toe is there and it's something that we can put force into, it will start to put more pressure into that big toe naturally. And over time, the big toe will need a smaller and smaller wedge until eventually it won't need a wedge and can press into the floor just naturally.
Yeah, this kind of makes me think of the point I was going to add to this checklist of get rid of the running shoes in the gym and start to train a bit more, either barefoot or with flat-soled shoes, because most of the time the cushions in your shoes aren't reducing that feeling that you're getting. Well, you're not having any feeling. There's the whole purpose of them. So when you're trying to deadlift or squat in runners, there's so much movement. You're trying to squat on a mattress, like it's constant. It's just not the right thing to do. So if you take off the shoes, not only is that going to help you get a better connection with the floor and feel those 3 points of contact, but you'll also be able to identify if you have a point that's coming up continuously, so you can see what's going on rather than being completely oblivious and thinking, oh, I just can't squat to depth. It's like, no, there's a reason why you can't squat to depth. Let's have a look. Literally just taking off your shoes will give you that better idea. And I think from when we spoke about, you got a point here about making sure you're loading the correct position through like even weight distribution, like the bar path. So when you've got runners on or something like that, you might be all in your toes and you don't feel it, because from an outsider looking in, you can see the runner is essentially flat, but all you're doing is loading all through the toes. You're like, why can't I get into this? Why am I always falling forward? As a coach, you'll be able to probably see, due to the mechanics being wrong, what's going on. But as an individual, you probably don't even need that external eye, because by taking off the shoe gets you to feel that feeling, and you'll feel all your toes in the floor and no heel, or all heel. Because that's another one, when people are all in their heels and not enough in their toes in their deadlift. The shoulders are behind the bar and they're always doing like a stripper deadlift. And you're like, it's because you're loaded wrong. And as soon as you push that big toe down, they're like, fuck, where did this strength come from? It's like, oh, look at that.
Yeah, that's a really nice way of thinking about it. And I think something that Max Rosowski said when he came on talking about weightlifting is just focus on the balance point of your feet. If you're aware of where your weight is with the bar in your foot and it's in the middle, then it'll tidy up so many things. And that's true in squatting and deadlifting as well. If you're a coach and what you're looking at side on for their weight distribution, you're basically looking at the sum total of their body mass and the weight on the bar should be over the middle of the foot. And for this Toei deadlifter I was talking about earlier, in his setup, it was actually astonishing how much of his body was in front of the bar in that setup position. I'd say it was at least 60% in front of the bar. So all his upper body mass and even his hips were very close to being on top of the bar. So it was very apparent that his weight was in his toes. Even if his heels were touching the floor, there'd barely be any weight in them. And a nice way you can assess this, if you've got a piece of paper, is basically put a piece of paper under each of the 3 points of contact. So one under the heel, one under the ball of the big toe, one under the ball of the pinky toe. And you shouldn't be able to pull that paper out at any stage during the lift. And if you can, that's a great indicator that the pressure on that part of the foot has gone. And yeah, I think
I'd love to see the coach
Yeah.
with the bit of paper. Like, go on, do your deadlift and pull. See, oh, no, heels are up. Heels are up. I pulled the paper
Yeah.
out.
Yeah. But it's a great coaching cue to say, don't let me pull this paper out. So I I actually
Yeah, I know. I
just
agree.
used
Yeah.
something else. But I think that yeah, where's the overall mass compared to the feet? It should be in the middle of the foot, not toey, not heely.
I think one of the most important parts that we mentioned above was the feeling of the glutes and the squats in your
Yes.
the feeling of the glutes in your squats and your deadlifts, because again, that is a massive telltale sign of what's being loaded and what's not doing enough of the work, and then what injuries are becoming apparent because of this.
Yeah, exactly. So in squats and deadlifts, we should be able to get the glutes working. It doesn't mean they have to be the sorest muscle after a squat or deadlift session. Like we said earlier, everyone's going to be predisposed to use certain muscle groups more or less, but you should be able to get some glute activity in both of those movements. And if you're not, then that is an indicator that foot dysfunction might be something that's going on because of that internal rotation connection we're talking about earlier. And this could be the foot stays stuck in that high arch position, or it could be that the foot is flat and can't then flatten further. So if you can connect the dots between what you're seeing at the foot and what you're seeing in the rest of the body, then that's a really useful assessment tool to say, right, they're not able to load the posterior chain and their foot is flat and not able to pronate any further, or it's stuck in a high arch. And what I've seen, this is the assessment I saw this week, was as the athlete lunged or squatted, the foot would actually roll the other way. So the arch would rise rather than flatten. And as we discussed with Rob's toes out earlier, the important thing is that there's a movement towards flattening. It doesn't have to be fully flat as a pancake on the floor, but it has to move in that direction. So it can go from a high arch to a medium arch, or a medium arch to a low arch, and anything sort of in that direction. And that's the mechanics we want to see. But what you'll quite often see with these dysfunctional feet is that as they descend into the movement, the arch moves the other way. So the foot's now rolling out, which is essentially putting the brakes on rather than allowing the acceleration of the movement. And this is where that jarring stress has to go somewhere. It has to go either into the knee or typically in the lower back if you're deadlifting.
Nice. And I guess the ability to internally rotate your hips is a bit of a thing to focus on.
Yeah, exactly. So it's very related in that if the foot can't pronate, then the tibia won't turn inwards, which means the femur won't turn inwards, and that means the hips can't internally rotate. So they're all, yeah, incredibly connected.
So it just means that at the end of the day, you won't be loading your glutes, your VMO, or anything like that to give you the most possibility to get the most out of it. So I guess those sort of dysfunctions then will lead to things like knee pain and other stuff. What else would they? What else have you seen from special assessments that some of these things have led to beyond knee pain?
Yeah, so like directly, you could be getting pain in the ankle. Like, so if your foot is jammed and you're not getting that unlocking, then you could get a compression feeling. Like a lot of people get this when they're trying to do calf mobility stuff and they just get a blocking feeling in the front of the ankle because the foot isn't able to unlock. So they get that pinchy pain, or if they're doing pistols or deep squatting, that comes on. You see it related also to calf strains or tears where the calf is having to do extra work, or Achilles injuries because the foot isn't able to unlock and stiffen appropriately. Yeah, basically any lower body injury, even like upper body injuries, can have a component of foot mechanics in. But I'd say the real common ones you'd see are knee injuries, big linkage to foot mechanics, and like lower backs can come from almost anywhere as well. But typically, feet and hips would be my first ports of call to check. If somebody's getting lower back pain deadlifting, what's going on in their hips and how does that relate to the feet? Because it always relates to the feet as well.
Yeah, and I know that when I had issues with my SI joint, like that, a lot of that stemmed from before I actually had a greater understanding of what my feet were doing, because it's you just presume they are just these slabs of meat and bone on the floor that just do what they're supposed to do because they stand you up all day or they rest when you're not. They know exactly what they're supposed to do. And it's like, to some degree, that is true if you constantly access positions and you constantly put yourself into things that your body goes, okay, I need to still have access to this. I need to still be able to do that. But because we are so much more sedentary nowadays, or our movements aren't as 3D as they used to be, they're now so much more just up, down, if you're lucky, left to right, very rarely any rotation. So all these sort of things allow the ankle and like the feet to be taken through these full ranges of motion that they know they need to access. But because we're so static now with a lot of our stuff, that's why the feet lock up and get themselves set in a position, because they know they can support all your weight through them. Because they say, right, let's stay here because this is going to be the best possible way to live without discomfort. And then we go and do extreme things and our body's like, fuck you, we can't get there. And you're like, yeah. And then all these pains start to become prevalent.
Exactly. We talked about this a lot in our toe spacer episode, about what the feet like in terms of stimulation. And as I said earlier, there's 26 bones, 33 joints in the feet, and they evolved to walk on uneven surfaces. So previously we'd be walking on, beaches, on routes in the woods. All these uneven contours would open and close these joints of the foot. So they'd be getting so much more stimulation. They'd be getting all the foot and lower leg muscles lengthened in so many different ways. Whereas nowadays we walk on flat surfaces, roads, pavements, indoors, and we wear stiff shoes which don't allow this articulation of the foot. So we're no longer getting the joint stimulation through the feet that we previously would, which means proprioceptively we're leaving a lot on the table that would benefit our performance big time.
Nice. So I guess this episode has also made me think we need to revisit the knee valgus stuff, because that was such an early episode, and how much our feet impact going up the body to our knees. I think it might be a really interesting topic to dive back into. And if you haven't listened to the episode, I'm pretty sure it's episode 4. Go back to our early doors, have a little listen, kind of get a bit of a baseline understanding of why knees in isn't the end of the world, and maybe waiting. I don't know what the saying is, but get ready for another episode where we dive a little bit deeper into that knee valgus and talk about how some of these relationships with your feet and your hips cause and help you become a stronger athlete. So I hope for all you feet fanatics out there, you really enjoyed today's episode. I know I did, and I'm sure Ash did, since this is his area of speciality. As always, if you did enjoy it, please share it with anyone that has a foot fetish or anything like that. We'd love to get this message out there and tell people to start really looking at feet and have a little bit of a deeper dive into those toes. So thank you as always for listening. We really do appreciate you every single week. Please do keep sharing the message. And if you do want to ask us a question or get us to cover an episode on something, head over to our Instagram page at lunge.lift and ask us a question there. And we'll be sure to hopefully get an episode put together for you specifically. So thank you very much as always, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, guys.